My name is Marcus Larsson. I run the business development organization for PARC. And if by the off chance you don't know exactly where you are right now, I'll just say that we're a research company, subsidiary of Xerox, and we develop breakthrough technologies for our partners and clients in the government, startup, and the corporate space. So we've hosted this PARC Forum event about monthly, going back as far back as 1977. Where we invite luminaries and thought leaders in science, technology, and innovation to debate and exchange ideas right up on this very stage. And there will be some refreshments served after this event is over. And if you feel the urge to live tweet this event as it progresses, use the hashtag PARC Forum so the word gets out. And if you're not on the newsletter or you're not on the PARC Forum newsletter, feel free to sign up. You can go to parc.com or you can sign up outside as you leave. Now, PARC, we have a long history in doing research in artificial intelligence, dating back from our very founding, where most of that, of course, was focused on natural language processing. Today, there's, of course, a whole other host of topics that I'm sure our two Fireside chat individuals will get into a little bit during the program today. But without further ado, let me then introduce our speakers. First, Tolga, simply the CEO of PARC. Tolga. And joining Tolga in conversation will be Kara Swisher, who's the executive editor and co-founder of Recode.
Okay.
So let's get started.
So we want to do a discussion between us, but we also want you all to participate and ask questions of this topic. It's kind of a big, broad topic that is hard to sort of corral in, because AI is kind of everything going forward. It's like saying the ethics of computing. And so we want to talk a little bit about what they're doing here at PARC and some of our thoughts on what's happening, and then get on and have a sort of a lively discussion about it, because I think the idea of where we're going next in computing has a lot to do, as we've seen over the past year, with deep impact on society. And so there's issues of obviously ethics, there's issues around diversity, there's issues around whether we should do things or not. The whole idea of where the human race is going, especially because it's impacting jobs, it's impacting how we live, and in much more profound ways than ever before. So why don't we start talking a little bit about where you see the current discussion, because there's a lot, besides being a lot at stake, there's a lot swirling because it's still in its nascent stages. I think most people agree that even though there's been great strides in AI, that it's still early on in the invention stage.
Yeah. I think the discussion has multiple kind of facets to it. First of all, I think everybody is realizing more and more that how prominent AI is. It's just not this one sort of blip in technology wave that would just go away after a while, after it loses its sort of sexiness, if you will. It's there for to stay, and I think people and corporations realize that, and we're hearing more and more, what does it mean for the future, and at all levels, right? So what does it mean for me as an individual, the skill set that I have, what do I know, what do I don't know, what do I need to learn to be relevant in a world that's dominated by AI, to organizations, to businesses, and we get a lot of corporations at the highest level to come and really talk about what should our AI strategy be? What should our machine learning strategy be, et cetera? So I think part of that discussion is realization of the longevity of the technology and how prominent and dominant it would be in defining, how the future would look like. And then, of course, that we're seeing, there's different kinds of companies, if you will. There's the tech giants, and there's other companies that maybe outside of the traditional tech domain that have awareness and willingness to really adopt AI technologies and whatnot. And it's making its way. It's making its way, as you said, into the society, into the consumer world, into the enterprise and business world. And with that comes also an awareness of some of the shortcomings of the technology. And so part of the discussion is about, I think, the great potential that it holds for the future. And now we're seeing, past the hype curve, it's there to stay. And part of the discussion is about, with technology comes some, responsibility and some shortcomings and flaws. And how do we really think about that in creative and intelligent ways? So that we start addressing that.
Start with the positive parts. Because we are in a period where we're seeing repercussions from past technologies or past technologies that have moved their way into the mainstream, and the lack of thoughtfulness in creating them and understanding implications. But let's start with where we are in terms of the promise right now of things that are happening. I would say we were probably in a stage, I think a lot of people agree, in a very, as I said, a nascent stage of invention of what these things can be applied to. So why don't you talk a little bit about that, like where we are right now in the cycle, because I do think it's, we're starting to reach the implementation phase, I guess, the execution phase, which has implications of who is good at implementing these kind of technologies.
Yes, I think it's a parallel. So certainly the invention phase is still ongoing, right? So every day we're hearing yet another application domain or area where AI generates results. I mean, if you look at the past history, there's a lot of examples where, with AlphaGo to
talk about AlphaGo for example.
Beating humans in certain things and whatnot, to really interesting applications.
That was diagnostics, right? They were just recently doctor diagnostics.
Medical diagnostics, breast cancer screening, for example. I read an article the other day that AI algorithms essentially can do that more accurately than some of the health professionals and doctors can do. To manufacturing and really enabling the digital transformation of the industrial base and some of the manufacturing capabilities, to transportation. I mean, think about what it enables with urban mobility and those kinds of concepts and smart cities. So it's essentially everywhere. Another part of it is the autonomy side, where we see more and more machines that can that can see, that can think, that can listen and respond, that can even talk to us these days, that are being elevated to levels that we didn't think was possible before. So all of that is happening simultaneously. New inventions and new applications in many different domains, and but at the same time, so the professionals in the AI space, we talk often about sort of narrow AI and the generic AI, if you will. Narrow AI is the application of AI to sort of a very specific task, if you will. And more applications, if you look at it, are being kind of conquered by AI in that narrow AI field. And then there's, this notion of generic AI, which computer agents and computation mimicking human level intelligence without being prescribed to a specific task at hand. And on that one, there's quite a journey to be hauled to really reach to the level. So I think invention continues, adoption continues. If you look at with that sort of classification of narrow AI versus generic AI, a lot of advancements on one, still a lot to go on the other one.
So, I mean, the notion that I think I've talked a lot about is the idea that anything that can be digitized will be digitized. That's how I look at like anything. Every single job, every single application, every single way that we use computing or the way we act will be digitized. And anything that isn't will be left, essentially. Mostly creative jobs, for example, or relatively creative jobs, or things that require more human interaction initially, and eventually probably not. So talk about where that hits. Right now, a lot of the focus is on a couple areas. Autonomous vehicles is an obvious area. But medical is the other one. Industrial applications. Where do you think the most of the development, the most promising development is going on right now?
I think a little bit of all of the above, right? So all the three industries you had mentioned are fairly fairly advanced, I think, when it comes to different kinds of AI applications. In terms of jobs and job types that would be digitized, the jury's still out, so to speak, right? So there's different studies by different organizations on that as to what percentage of what job type could be automated with the current set of capabilities and whatnot. And as you suggested, a lot of it that can be automated and digitized today are still kind of more repetitive and kinds of tasks that are done in sort of structured environments, et cetera. And as you go on that scale to more dynamic, unstructured, non-repetitive tasks, which touches a lot of human creativity and maybe the sort of the soft side of who we are as human beings are harder to do. That said, it's interesting. I was part of a panel a couple months back and was a panelist, also academician, in the field of, I think, computational musics or something to that extent, where they have been developing, AI algorithms that can actually compose, songs and generate and produce music, right? So where is that boundary exactly? It's kind of hard to tell. But the interesting thing is, if you actually look at the history of AI, it started with we, the programmers, prescribing what the machine needs to kind of execute to today's modern AI and mostly machine learning algorithms like deep learning and whatnot, where you don't need to prescribe what the machine needs to do. All you have to do is feed a bunch of data, and then it comes up, it learns by itself and comes up with suggestions and decisions and classification capabilities, prediction capabilities, et cetera. So. And that makes it really interesting from this question, right? So where is that boundary? Where does that end? If there's enough data and enough computational power, how far can we push the envelope in terms of digitizing ourselves and our lives?
So let's talk about that, because we'll get to the ethical considerations. Right now, the United States has most of the top AI the leading superstars in the field, or mostly in the United States, working in the United States.
You mean sort of more on the corporation side?
Yeah,
or more on the academic
in corporations
side?
or wherever. The top AI engineers are here in this country. That said, another country, China, has more people working at it and more people working in the field, like doers, essentially, as opposed to thinkers.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about who's right now leading this, because what I want to get into is the fact that, Kai-Fu Lee's been out sort of banging this drum pretty hard. The superpowers. The AI superpowers. But it's not something to not think of. The first internet age was essentially a US-led revolution. This may not be that, in that, and the implications of that, and the implications of the Chinese government being behind a lot of this, and not necessarily in nefarious ways, that owning the future, essentially. Yeah. So talk a little bit about where we are of the development and where it is, because I think you could pretty much say most of the early stuff, until now, computing has been a Western-led affair, essentially.
Yes. I think it's too early to tell who's leading or who's winning that war. But there is no question. I think you referenced the book. There's no question that China is becoming increasingly more a heavyweight superpower when it comes to AI and computational technologies. And if you actually think about it, for every tech giant that we can name in the Western world, we can name a similar or analogous one in China that has similar market cap and similar kind of applications in the technology domain. If you look at on the academic side, and again, I'm not a full expert on that, but there's evidence. If you look at AI-driven kind of open competitions, number of papers issued, published, patents issued, and things like that, there is an enormous amount of resurgence, I would say, in activity, and I think the Chinese government doesn't make it. It made it pretty public how kind of strategic AI investments, technology investments are when it comes to AI as a technology and becoming an AI-driven kind of superpower. So like I said, I think we have to look. a number of different aspects of that. Clearly, there is no shortage of effort and investment in it. The Western world is doing that as well, and China has a different sort of domestic market dynamics, if you will, when it comes to, it has a very different privacy and security concerns in the consumer space. It has a very different sort of governance structure and dynamics between the government and the citizens, et cetera, compared to the Western world, as we know. The interesting question is whether what does that really lend itself to, right? So does that enable a long-term sustained advantage in one way or another, or not? And how should the Western world think about that in terms of making meaningful investments to not stay too behind?
Right. Well, I think but a lot of people feel, and I would agree with them, is that there's a question of who can be who can be fast to this, which the Chinese are faster.
Yeah.
Who can go in a mass way with data, especially with data collection, which is, again, I think most people are looking at the data sets, and there's a reason why Sundar Pichai was in front of Congress yesterday talking about going into China.
Yeah.
He has to. They must go into China in some fashion in order to collect data and feed their own efforts. So in speed, in size, in commitment of the government to doing that, it's very clear that that's, President Xi's main focus is this. And while they're arguing over tariffs over plastic toys, really the issue is this. Talk a little bit about our government's efforts in this area and our academic research, because one of the things was this investment in broad research, the commitment to science, the commitment to technology.
Yeah.
I think you can pretty safely say this administration has has made no moves in this area. I think 0 would be probably the number. Tell me if I'm wrong, because I would
challenge that a little
on a
bit,
federal
right?
level. I'm not talking about the University of California or things like that, but where is the commitment from the government? Because that seems to be
there is commitment from the government. I mean, I can tell this because that's a big part of the business that we're in as PARC. A lot of our R&D activities, or significant amount of our R&D activities actually starts with doing R&D services for various different government agencies. And a large group of us was actually at DC a couple of months ago as part of DARPA's 60th anniversary, and where DARPA announced a $2 billion investment in AI called the Next AI program. So the investment is there. It's non-zero. It's substantial, and clearly some of the indications of the program structure, which is a little bit different than how DARPA normally conducts its business, alludes to the speed factor, right? So basically, want to explore many different paths by seeding many different capabilities in a shorter term. In a much shorter term than a typical DARPA program, and then really letting that sort of organically grow into a set of strategic capabilities in the AI space. How that will, what kind of results that would lead into, I think we'll know. But clearly, there is a global level competition that each of the governments realize, and then there's investments on both sides to come up on top on that race.
Well, when you think about the question of ethics, and does there have to be a country or a philosophy that leads this going forward, given how many implications it has on everything? I mean, if you think computing has affected everything, this runs the world, correct?
Yeah, that's an interesting way to pose the problem. I mean, when I think about the ethics problem, in a lot of ways, it kind of touches us as humans and human values. So when I sort of generalize at that level, why should that be, dominated by one nation or another? At the end, I think it's the human race, and a lot of those human values, the positive ones at least, are pretty common. So I think we have to look at from that perspective and actually think what that means for developers of these technologies and algorithms, globally everywhere in the world.
Meaning that there isn't a certain ethos that should be imputed here at the very beginning?
Well, in the end, it may play out that a particular nation dominates that. What I'm trying to say is, in a lot of ways, when you kind of dissect the ethics topic and talk about sort of, algorithmic accountability, fairness, establishing transparency in those algorithms and things like that, I think a lot of that is needed, globally, because a lot of the need for that essentially stems from, moral values that we have as human beings. That said, the Western world sets example when it comes to a certain set of societal values as well. Democracy, freedom of speech, etc., human rights. So if you look at from that perspective, I think then there's an opportunity to actually be kind of the role model to the rest of the world as to how technology development could be done in a responsible manner.
But if you're not leading it, you don't get to do that, right? You just
Yeah.
get to suggest it, right?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to, if you have a lot of the big AI developments have been in China, and a lot of it has to do with the surveillance of its citizens, which is useful in developing data, data sets.
Yeah, definitely.
And the willingness of this society to
I think that's lopsided between the two examples we're talking about, between China and the Western world. So while the ideal case scenario is for everybody to kind of pay attention to those things, if you think about what's the likelihood, where the thought leadership would come from, I think it's definitely the Western world because, as you said, right. So there's very different dynamics in China when it comes to privacy of data and those kinds of things, and regulations and the nature of the regulations, etc.
So who then sets those global standards? How do you start on that path? Where is the leadership right now on that? And then I want to get into diversity and.
I think it just doesn't exist today, right?
Yeah.
So that
was the answer.
Yes. So it would be foolish to say that we're down that path far enough yet, and that's a big part of the discussion, right? That's why it's important to really continue to talk about this topic. And we're seeing some initial signs coming out of Europe, mainly with GDPR and those kinds of regulations and whatnot too. But there's a lot more that needs to be done to get to a point where we feel comfortable about sort of ethics in AI overall.
Well, so where do you see some interesting discussions going on? I mean, real discussions, not just, gosh, we should be careful with this stuff.
Multiple places, right? So I think every major AI conference or event that I've been to has devoted significant amount of time in having discussions around, basic building blocks of ethics in AI, right? So what are some of the principles of algorithmic accountability? How do we make sure that we have, we understand, sort of responsibility, we understand, fairness and bias in those algorithms. How do we develop next generation AI algorithms that are transparent in nature? And we do some work in that here at PARC as well. How do we understand the bounds of the capabilities of those algorithms and whatnot, the scale and impact? I mean, it's very different when I get a song recommendation from my Spotify playlist to getting recommendations of what news article I need to read on my social media feed. Those are very different things, and I think it's going to become a more and more intense conversation and dialogue going forward, because one of the underlying reasons why it becomes important is a lot of where these algorithms are making predictions are outside of what they have been typically used for, which is more kind of objective problems, if you will. Right. Problems that have one answer, but if I want to do stress analysis on a bridge or calculate aerodynamics on a plane wing, You can use AI, you can use a lot of sophisticated algorithms, but that doesn't really have the kind of societal impact that those algorithms might actually have when it comes to messy human affairs and things like that. You know, we see. I'll give some examples, right? So teacher evaluations for education this is one. Think about false positives, false negatives in sort of medical diagnostic situations. We see these algorithms being used more and more in sentencing decisions, parole, probation, those kinds of things. Job applications, HR decisions, entailing those kinds of things, and then it goes well beyond, some of the more traditional things that we use computation for, with a potentially very high degree of societal impact, and then all these other things: accountability, fairness, unbiased, etc. Transparency becomes really, really important.
Yeah, because humans are so good at not being biased. But they've done such a crack-up job so far in the millennia. So when we talk about this, let's talk about who owns it then who controls it. There's a lot of debate. There's two things. One around diversity of who is developing it, obviously, which will impact it, and we'll talk about it in a second. And the other is the size of the companies that now own it. Right now, I think probably Facebook and Google are pretty dominant, right? Probably Google, and then Facebook, and then Amazon coming in a third, right? Would that be?
Roughly.
Maybe Microsoft. There's a lot of people pushing against the idea of that, the idea that these companies are collecting sort of all the players in this field. How does that, is that inevitable, or is there something that has to happen? There's obviously OpenAI efforts by Sam Altman, and Elon Musk, and others.
AI and those kinds of things. So who owns it question is interesting. So is that sort of who's responsible for it in sort of a more corporate setting? Is that,
well, it's just that these companies are collecting all the pieces.
I think they are, and it has an interesting kind of dynamic to it, right? So we have to think about, ultimately what drives it is we're building these computational infrastructures, and there are a certain set of kind of business models that those infrastructures essentially support and optimize for, right? So I mean, and it's all about ads and searches and online advertising, etc. That requires deep understanding of a number of personality traits and who we are and our behavioral patterns and things of that nature, so that it could be it could be used in ways that really feeds into those business models. Right. And that's where the potential challenges start to arise. So as long as those infrastructures are what they are, and those business models are what they are, and there isn't enough kind of discussion around, again, transparency, audit, governance, etc. Then there are going to be continuation of collection of those data, because ultimately, like I said, that's what they need to be able to optimize for. Let's take Facebook as an example. That's essentially it optimizes for attention, essentially, right? So how much time do I spend?
Attention,
likes,
engagement,
dislikes, engagement,
virality, and speed, right?
comments I put there, etc. And that's what the gigantic infrastructure is built for. So we can approach the problem in multiple ways. I think one way is to think about what's the longevity of these business models, which is an interesting question. I actually never got it in the first place, but that's just me. And then the other question is, what do we need to establish some processes and have some governance and have some transparency and audit capabilities, so that we don't let all of that data to be collected and used in optimization schemes that amplifies
by
the
two
problem.
or three players.
By a small number of big players.
Well, two, really. I'm sorry, it's just two, and that I can say. Well, and then in China, right, which doesn't. It's pretty much true.
Yeah.
It's pretty much true this way. So how do you do anything about that? Is there anything to be done? Because, I mean, a lot of people talk about this idea of owning, it's like owning all the railroads. It's owning all the roads.
Yes, of course, there's a lot of things. I mean, there's a lot of things that we can, I mean, when I think about this, I think about sort of the data, the algorithms, the processes, and the people. You have to kind of attack the problem. It's a very complex problem, and it's multifaceted in that regard. So the algorithms themselves is actually usually the culprit, but if you think about it, they're not the cause, but they're the symptom in a lot of ways. I mean, it's garbage in, garbage out. A lot of these algorithms, whatever you feed in,
Right.
You know, if you're training them with a particular demographic for whatever decision that they're doing, if you feed need data in, guess which demographic is likely to come out on the other end of the algorithm, right?
Yes.
So it's very simple logic when it comes to that. So, but we can do things in all of those different facets of it, right? So the data, as my example alludes to, we have to be very careful, and that's where things like diversity come into play, right? So we have to make sure that the developers of these algorithms and the technologies really understand that literally garbage in, garbage out, right? So and there have to be some safeguards and checks and balances to make sure that the data that feeds these algorithms are kind of diverse in many different ways.
All right. Okay, talk about, that's a really important issue. What, you know the numbers right now, what they are, of who develops these algorithms. They're primarily, I think it's the 90s, it's in the 90% range of, it's white men, correct? Is that right? I think pretty much.
I don't know the exact number.
98%.
But okay. I believe
That's high.
it. Yeah. So
It's high in my opinion.
yeah. So I think that the absolutely high number. No question about that. So this
makes the 70% look great, which is not great either.
Which is really well. I think that is a prominent factor in all of this, right? So when I talk about sort of the data diversity, obviously that is highly influenced by the developers of the data in the first place. But I'm gonna make a build. I'm gonna make an and, if you will. It's absolutely critical that you have diversity and a very representation from various different groups when it comes to that. But I think there is another thing that's in sort of the people aspect of this, that the people that are developing these algorithms, and I have a lot of people probably in the audience that are computer scientists as well. So no offense to everybody in computer science, but they're not inclined to actually really be able to kind of think about some of these social implications and things like that. So to me, while it's super important to have diverse teams developing these algorithms, just as important is having a dialogue and a discussion forum that includes various different types of stakeholders in this as well, and not only computer scientists, more social sciences, policy makers, and corporate governance, whatever we need to have, whomever we need in that dialogue, I think needs to be on the discussion table to actually really think about.
How do you get that? I mean, I've written columns saying there should be humanities courses for people. Like
I think part of it is this is one of the recommendations from AI Now, right? So is that the AI and computer science education needs to expand in terms of what material and what curriculum it actually has today. Those programs need to start including some of these human sciences and social sciences aspect of it, so people actually have a chance to understand the potential implications of what technology could do to the society.
Right, and how do you make that happen? Where does that have to go at the university level? I mean, it can't be me handing out Animal Farm to everyone I meet, or what? I mean, what? I mean,
it starts with the dialogue. I don't know the exact
Please
answer
read this.
to that. So
this might be a good book.
I think awareness is also key, right? So academic institutions are also fairly responsive, at least in the Western world, to the market demand, right? In terms of how they shape their curriculums, et cetera. So I think one of the things we need to do is continue to kind of amplify the awareness about this, and continue to advocate the importance of it, and create that need and demand and pressure, if you will, so that it becomes a real conversation for the academic institutions as well. And we see initial signs of that, right? So
From who? Because I don't. I have to tell you, I don't. I see a lot of talking about it, but I do. These curriculums really are orienting themselves in ways. If I say Hannah Arendt to anybody in Silicon Valley, they look at me like I've fallen off a tree, or anybody, any of these books, any of the many books you should read.
Like I said,
or any of the concepts and theories. I mean, these programs are quite, that I can see, do not include that or do not require it, or have an because it seems like taking an ethical course. It's like taking a diversity course at in companies. They do it sort of grudgingly versus being part of the entire.
I don't
experience.
know. Maybe we should look into how it started in the medical profession, because there's a lot of ethical considerations in that and whatnot too. But the point I was trying to make is, we're seeing report after report coming out, and kind of really building a momentum behind making people aware that that's one of the changes that are needed to be implemented. And what would it take to academic institutions to kind of really follow that is a question that we need to answer, I think.
All right, I want to finish up talking about government intervention in this. Do you see that being a big issue? Obviously, Europe has been very aggressive in forcing people to be doing things, and Europe is much more. California has a larger privacy bill. There's all kinds of. You could see these being done by states like California or the EU, but what about where is effective government intervention here? Because even just in this country, watching this week's with Sundar Pichai, please watch it if you want to understand how stupid politicians are. It's like astonishing. Where there's some really major issues to talk to Google about, and they didn't. They lost the opportunity. They had the CEO there and wasted it with inane questions about inane topics, which were inaccurate at the same time. And so, where is the role of government in this? Because the government can be an important part of this.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's a
role. This is just the U.S. It's a worldwide issue. It could be, it could be whether it's in India or whether it's anywhere. It could be. But where is there are bright lights in California, for example. I see probably Gavin Newsom probably having some impact. He's very interested in these topics, or the EU with Margaret Vestager.
Local, really deep understanding of the technology world, etc. So going back to the earlier part of your question, the government definitely has a role to play, with regulations and whatnot. I think, as you pointed out, I think when it comes to data rights and regulating AI, last year when I was at Web Summit, there was a lot of, kind of political representation from various EU members there, and it was a fairly dominant topic. Right. So as to what the government roles ought to be in regulating AI and future AI technologies, autonomous driving, etc. What exactly that is, you should also look always on the other side of the coin as well, right? So I personally think that there is a certain level of regulation would be healthy, but you have to also be careful about not overcorrecting that, because
since there's been none.
Yes. So right now there's not a risk.
There's no overcorrecting.
You can go below zero. That's for sure.
Yeah. There's been none. There's been zero regulation in this area. So.
The other side of that is, I think I mentioned sort of overcorrecting and whatnot too. I think I put this in the context of the global competition as well.
Right.
We talk about China versus the Western world and whatnot, and EU. So you have to be really careful, but you also shouldn't kind of let that be the reason for non-action, if you will. Right? So,
well, it's a really interesting argument recently being made by a lot of tech leaders here in this country. I did a podcast with Mark Zuckerberg, and he said a lot of things that got more attention. But the thing that I was most struck by was when he essentially said, and it's been repeated by other tech leaders, about the challenges from China, and he essentially said it's Xi or me. Like you could have their government run things and them run the internet, them run the future, or me. And I was like, that's my choice. That's a terrible choice.
Yeah, I think
I don't like either choice. Where's C? Where's
Yeah,
you know.
I think that's.
I was like Nancy Pelosi in her coat. I'll
Yeah.
take that. I'll take that for whatever. The coat. I just want the coat.
Yeah.
That was something. Anyway, it was an interesting thing. Is that it's not that you're right. It's not that people they want to scare you into thinking, well, if we
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
let you do whatever you want,
Yeah.
I don't see government agencies at all intervening in any way, or showing leadership at least. I don't see any.
So far we haven't.
Yeah, yeah. So, so finishing up, and then let's get some questions from the audience to talk about this.
Yep.
When you look at these things, what's the most, you've seen a lot of these applications, and they could be everything from matching, like takeout food in under 30 minutes. There's all kinds of, a lot of the AI stuff being applied, say in China, is around mobile payments, which has blossomed there compared to here.
Yeah.
What is the most disturbing thing you've seen? And what is the most interesting application of it?
That exists, or
Yeah, that
that's
exists,
more
that you're
sort of
starting to talk about when they start to hear about it.
Futuristic. I don't know, the disturbing one. I mean, I'll give one example, which is I think super encouraging. At the same time, it can be really disturbing when you think about it. There's discussions about that brain science and digital self, and really how to build interfaces so that we can couple with algorithmic capabilities, so that we can actually use our brain and thoughts and things like that to control machines, etc. So or read or write to human brain. So that could be super exciting. It could be super scary at the same time, right? So that's one example. I think in terms of kind of interesting examples, healthcare is really interesting. So I think there's fascinating stuff going on at all levels, right? So if you go all the way down to the molecular level and using AI for drug discovery and really shortening that to personalized medicine, to coupling AI capabilities with wearables and other forms of sensing of physiological things, etc. Really has a high potential for transforming how we think about wellness and health, sort of a life in sort of a lifelong fashion, right? So I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, it is interesting. Some of the wearables. I was talking to someone. They're like, we could make a shirt that could stop you from eating that donut. Like it would go, you go like, and it would know that you couldn't have that at this hour, which seems like a good idea. Yeah. In any case, so why don't we have questions from the audience? We don't have too much time. Let's see. Let's go here and then there, and then right here first. Oh, here first, and then
right.
Here. This. Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
So the title of this, I believe, was Ethics and AI. And mostly what I heard was talk about bias in algorithms and a little tiny bit about transparency in algorithms, not much about that.
Yeah.
And maybe these questions you think of as being beyond the scope of what you wanted to address. But it seems to me, when I think of ethics and AI, the kinds of topics that come to mind are economic dislocation that's forecast, and what should society do to respond to that? Autonomous weapon systems, and are we going to somehow initiate some controls internationally over them? Control problem, as elucidated by Bostrom in superintelligence, and potential existential risk. Those are the ethical issues that I think of as being most important.
Okay.
Do you care to address those at all?
Let me talk about transparency, because I think that's an important sort of aspect of both ethics and as well as academic algorithmic accountability. I think it's really important, because I try to describe these algorithms, the way they work is you almost sort of grow intelligence as opposed to prescribing them what to do, and they're highly black box in nature in the way that they operate, and it's very, very difficult for end users to really understand the inner workings of these systems. And that poses a number of issues, right? So obviously that can manifest itself as bias that may be in the results. It can have it can have implications when it comes to legal liabilities and things like that. The list goes on and on and on, right? So there is, for example, at PARC, we've been working on developing sort of next generation AI capabilities and algorithms that are transparent in nature from the beginning. And the idea there is to be able to build these systems in a way that you break the black box nature of how they operate, but actually teach them simultaneously not only the task that they're trying to, or the problem that they're trying to solve, but also interpretations of that in a way that would be human understandable, so they can actually come back and articulate themselves. If you were to query, let's take an example. If you make a loan application, it got rejected. Why did it get rejected? And then you can actually kind of talk about that, as opposed to say, well,
It's
no,
just the
sorry.
result.
Yeah.
So talk about the
Yeah.
talk about the control. That's the Terminator issue, right? Like, essentially, boiled it. The idea of who has the control and where it goes once it, right? Who has the control?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on that at all, and those sophisticated autonomous weapon systems is not something that we work on, so I'm probably not the best person to comment on that. So.
Okay, right here and then back there, right here, and we'll go in the back.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you very much for your insights on the AI and how it grows. My question is about also the black box nature of AI. So assuming that 20, 30 years from now, we're going to have some AI models that are going to be trained for so many years doing certain things, and then one day we decide to tweak it to change its behavior. For a person, it's easy. You can take them to the courts, you can take them to a certain place. For code, you can tweak the lines, but for AI, it's not that simple. So is it gonna be that we're gonna somehow adapt to how that AI decides us to behave? Or are we gonna have mechanisms to tweak that behavior, you think? Like, what is your view on this?
Yeah, so I think when you say we program it, we can change it, right? So that's more of an AI. You're talking about, I think, is more machine learning and deep learning, where it's kind of purely data-driven ways of learning, and looks at the history to predict the future. So it's an interesting question. If it looks at the 20 years history and we want to change that, do we need to recreate another 20 years of data to really let it change its behavior? So I think that's an interesting question. I don't quite know the answer to that, but a lot of the current applications are actually not sort of building over that longevity of data, if you will. As I was alluding to earlier, there are more kind of narrow AI applications. It's still vast amount of data that you feed into them to be able to do, and most of those systems you can actually kind of retrain and enable kind of behavioral change, if you will, in the way that they operate. But for a generic AI system that just keeps learning over decades, that's a really interesting question. I don't know the answer.
That is one, actually. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
What do you do? You don't.
Yes.
Yeah, this question is more to Kara. So I just wanted to posit the exact opposite of what you said. How about we make everyone that studies, like, say, law or humanities, force them, or at least encourage them to take at least a couple of classes in computer science, algorithms, et cetera,
Yes.
rather than the converse,
Yep.
since it's going to be pervasive and apply to us all everywhere.
Because I think I agree. I think everybody should, look, I think that's, there's been a lot of talk about STEM and bringing that into people coding for everybody being required to do coding classes to understand it. But there are going to be experts of law, there's going to be experts of engineering, there's going to be experts of medicine. And so it's those people that need a more rounded education. I think you can just see it in this, listen, what's going on with, say, Facebook or Twitter right now is sort of like nursery school compared to the complexity of issues as they move across our globe, and they are obviously incapable of dealing with them. And it's not because they didn't take Jean-Paul Sartre. It's not because Mark Zuckerberg didn't finish college. That's not why. But it is in a group of people that are sort of without a lot of influence around them. Even just someone in a room that says, what? Like, there is nobody in those rooms that says what. I've been in those rooms later where I go, what? And they're always like, it's really an interesting experience. I can only give one example, just a small example. When Facebook put out Facebook Live, they showed it to reporters. They show it to reporters before they do it. And when I was looking at it, I said, well, what happens if someone kills someone? And they're like, what? What do you mean? And
That'll never happen.
Right, and I go, what about bullying? What about suicide? What about this? What about that? And they were like, look at the nice squirrels that you can see. Like, it was like, they just were like, they were sort of, it was a whole group of people that I think were very much oriented towards the opportunity. I had a really good discussion with Sam Altman on this. They're oriented toward the opportunity versus the problem.
Yes.
And so there's no irritant in the system. And so what I would like is more irritants in any system that we have, whether even with law or doctors or whatever. But I do think everybody should be taking computer courses. I think
And do you think that sort of irritants should come within the developers or within sort of third-party auditing and the people that are kind of more experts in kind of thinking about those scenarios?
Right now,
like
Mark has offered this Supreme Court of Facebook. Have you heard this idea that he has, that there's a group above that makes decisions because he's incapable of it? Or so, he said that. No, no joking. That's what his proposal is, right? He has a proposal to have an outside group.
Yeah.
It's called government, when I come from, but where, you know what I mean? Like, it's kind of funny when you think about it. So I don't know. I just think that when you get into these companies, it's like it's homogeneous. They're homogeneous in mentality and personality and what they eat and what they do, and I think that's never a good thing.
Yeah,
they eat really well. Just right here, I guess. I'm trying to get diversity in questions. Women, you need to ask some questions, please.
So it seems like the first questioner actually brought up the really good point about the actual primary purpose of some of these systems being a big issue. But it seems like, to the point about Facebook and some of these things, that some of the sort of underlying assumptions and underlying possibilities seem to be where it really gets difficult. I mean, it's easy enough to say we shouldn't have automated weapon systems and that's going to be a problem. But some of these other systems, we can't even seem to realize that it's a serious problem to have these systems considering who should get parole and what, sentencing and stuff. It's like, who thought that was a good idea for AI? I mean, what kind of idiot do you have to be? And yet we're doing it. We see it all over the place, right? And so how are people in this field thinking about some of those more underlying, problems that seem to me a little bit more intractable,
Yeah, it's a good question. It seems like with a lot of these people, every to a hammer, everything's a nail. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's like, oh, we can do it. Oh, we can do it. And then it iterates. It just seems like that. You're correct. I think there's not a thought. It's that we can do it, so why don't we? And it's easier when you do have something like autonomous weapons. It's like, oh no, we don't want that.
Yeah, it's a little farther out.
It's sort of easier. But when parole systems are so inherently biased and badly done by humanity, maybe there is a better solution of hiring. Maybe there is a better solution around.
Hiring is an interesting example, right? So I think I think it was a video that I was watching about a HR conference where some of these AI technologies were introduced for the first time for hiring decisions and whatnot. And I think it goes back to what Kara said earlier. People kind of gravitate towards kind of the opportunity and the positive side. And a lot of the HR executives thought that it was actually a really, really good alternative to human bias.
Right.
So as opposed to being a technology that creates a lot of problems, right, or replicates the same biases, or worse yet, amplifies it, right? So it's an interesting question, but I think people tend to kind of really think about the positive side and the opportunity side to use technology where it's appropriate. I think part of it is, again, educating and raising awareness that technology can actually result in unintended consequences, and what those are, and have the right set of processes and safeguards to not let that happen.
And we tend to
Or minimize it.
We tend to give technology the benefit of the doubt. Like, think about maps. I mean, I was just thinking that when I was driving here. Like, I used to have a map. I used to know the way to go, and now I just let Google tell me. Like, I just do. I don't know why. I just, like, you just, like, yeah, well, I don't do that. I didn't do that. But I think it's a really interesting thing is we tend to, when it seems sort of relatively benign, but it does lead to autonomous everything kind of stuff, because it's sort of easier, right? To abrogate decision making. And I think when I do hear like companies like, this is just a consumer company, but you can see it iterating everywhere, like Facebook or others saying, well, AI is going to solve the problems that we have here. You're sort of like, is it, where's the humanity, where's the humans in it? But it's such a big problem humans can't solve. It's kind of almost impossible, given the size and mass of information flowing over these systems, for humans to even be close to solving anything. Let's get a nice woman right here.
Maybe last question.
Yeah, we have one more question.
So AI works best where there's the most data.
Yes.
And so it seems to me that one of the things that we're at risk of is losing individuality and having where the data lies swamp out the places where there's less data, which is most likely to be people of lower economic means.
Yes.
So how do we create a system in which individuality and choice can be recognized, and particularly where people with the most data don't swamp out the people with less data?
Or you could put that on their heads, that more people have to give up data, they don't get to opt out of it.
Which is why I said, how
Right.
do we keep people with more data? If I choose to use cash instead of my Apple Pay,
Right.
am I not as valuable to the system? Does that mean that I don't have rights that somebody else does? Does that mean that the system is going to be sculpted only for those people who are willing to give up their data?
Yes. Yes. Well, no, but on the other side of it is you can also opt out of, like, this was an interesting argument that was going on between Tim Cook and Mark Zuckerberg, actually, which was Tim was talking about how, you're the product, that they're selling you every minute of the day at Facebook and all these, and Google, which is what Tim Cook would say, because it's not in that business, but it's also, he's actually correct. As opposed to Mark Zuckerberg, who said, oh, your Apple products are so expensive, poor people can't afford them, we're giving them free products, but you have to give over data. Like, so you could almost see the use of poor people for their data, and rich people could opt out of being part of the system too. So it sort of has both sides.
Yeah.
But yes, I don't know, what do you, I think absolutely. I think people are gonna, if you're not part of the system, you're not gonna get the benefits from the system. At the same time, if you're rich enough, you can opt out of the more creepy parts of the system. If you're poor, you're gonna have to be.
But I think some of the things, the regulations with GDPR and whatnot, and kind of making some of the privacy choices default as opposed to something that you have to go in and pick, etc. There might be some regulatory solutions to that. If you want to increase the sort of the cost of opting out, if you will.
But I spent a lot of
but
time
it
in
is a fundamental
Washington.
problem.
They're not. They don't have any idea what's going on. I spent a lot of time, and I sit in these congressional offices, and I'm like, oh my God, like, you really don't understand. And then the Google lobbyists come in, and the Facebook lobbyists, and the other lobbyists. So.
Great.
You are the product. Okay. Last one. Right here in the middle, this woman right here. Right in the back, in the middle back. Sorry. Sorry, there's other questions you can ask Tolga.
Yeah, coming back to the regulation, I came from the automotive industry, so the industry for many years and have formed a self kind of correlation, governance for the safety. So probably the disruptors are now quite buy into that, but the OEMs are very much into safety. Mm-hmm. So I think the history comes from they pay too much by all these legal issues, so the legal fees. So it may have to come down to there's enough people to sue these big companies for the damage inflicted on population. So for them to feel the pain, So they will start with self-regulation. Do you see it? That is part, maybe one of the options.
So lawyers are our only hope?
Well,
Oh, God.
you know, in general, I don't think, the lawyer is, well, I think the history of the law, it has
Yeah,
a lot
I
of,
get your
yeah,
point.
because maybe we should invest the public funding to promote lawyers,
Safety,
promote and computer scientists to actually look at the ethics side of it instead of just programming to make something incremental benefits to the society.
Yeah, we've certainly protected the internet industry. Like, if you want to drive an internet person crazy, say, I think Section 230 should be gotten rid of. And they go, because it gave them broad immunity. It's the Communications Decency Act. And it gives the platforms broad immunity from any legal problems, what happens on their platforms. And right now, I think one of the reasons so many of these abuses have happened is because they don't have any responsibility for what's on them. But yeah, that's an interesting, I don't know.
Yeah, we have to be careful what we're incenting, and if the only incentive that we put as part of the solution is through litigation, that's an interesting concept, I think.
Yeah, it is. It's interesting. But you're right. It worked.
But we have to think about how to build incentives.
But it worked in cars, right? So. It's unsafe at any speed. I think that Ralph Nader book was critical, and a lot of what happened in those litigations was critical to seatbelts and safety things, or else we'd be still running around and, well, like on scooters right now, like I am. Like I'm sure it's really dangerous, and I probably shouldn't be on them. But it's an interesting idea for sure. All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Tolga.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.